Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of In the Spotlight. I'm very excited tonight because he has been a writer for over 40 years for such shows as Murder, She Wrote, Simon and Simon, WKRP in Cincinnati, and who could forget that he was at one time the press secretary for the legendary Groucho Marx. It is my honor to introduce to you the one and only Steve Stoliar. And Steve, I want to thank you for coming on today. It's a real honor for me.
It's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
So, Steve, let me ask you, as a young kid, did you have a love for TV, for films? I mean, how did it begin for you?
Both, all of the above. I mean, I remember being taken to movies when I was a little kid, or our parents would take me to drive-ins, and they'd always bring a pillow and blanket for when I'd fall asleep. I remember seeing Ben-Hur uh, at a drive-in. And then years later, my parents were going to go to the drive-in, and I said, uh, "Don't we need to get the pillow and the blanket?" And they started laughing, and they said, "That was just for when you were like 4." I didn't know that. I thought that's just part of the automatic regalia for. We had 3 black and white TVs in our house in St. Louis, and I watched all sorts of stuff, from old silent movies up through, Captain Kangaroo and Romper Room and important series such as those. I always had a, a weakness for old, I guess I called them old time movies back then. Those tend to just be the silent ones. I saw the early sound films as just old movies. I didn't think about how old they were. As a matter of fact, before we left St. Louis when I was 7 in 1962, shortly before we left, the Three Stooges were they were on a press tour to promote whatever their latest mediocre feature film with Joe DeRita was. Um, and I had been loving watching their old two-reelers on television. And when I saw them in person in St. Louis, I didn't understand why they looked so old, because I didn't understand that I was watching shorts from the 30s and 40s. And I couldn't figure out why Curly looked so different from the Curly I was used to. It didn't make sense. And then Larry had his hair slicked back instead of frizzed out. And I remember at one point Mo said something about, and Larry combs his head with an egg beater. And I remember thinking, even though I was like 6, I remember thinking, that joke doesn't really work because his hair isn't frizzed out, so the egg beater image doesn't work. So even then, I was sort of having to cope with the dissonance between how old comedians looked in their old movies and how they look today. But it was still, a real kick to see the Three Stooges right off of my television set and in full color standing in front of me. But I've always loved old movies, and now because of YouTube, I'm able to catch up on a lot of things I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Episodes of old TV. I loved The Twilight Zone and Thriller, and all you have to do is press play now. It isn't like when I was a kid where you had to wait to see what was on in TV Guide and then will yourself to stay awake past Carson, past Tom Snyder's Tomorrow Show, into the netherworld of local car commercials, and just to cross a classic film off your list. Now you can take a gizmo out of your pocket, and with a couple of taps, you're watching an old movie that would have been hard pressed to see any of years ago.
Yeah, and the thing of it is, too, Steve, that impressed me way before anybody had television sets in their house is I think of, the comedy act of Laurel and Hardy. And most of the time, in a lot of their sketches, there was no sound, and still they were able to capture the audience. And that's a credit to the writers doing it, which people don't realize just how impactful writers are to the whole script of everything, whether it's TV, films, whatever. Because, like, an actor has, I think of Tom Hanks, he's often said, I'm only as good as the writing that's in front of me. And it's really true, because you could be a phenomenal actor without a good script, it won't work.
Right. And someone just yesterday emailed me and said, how much of the Marx Brothers movies were ad-libbed? And I said somewhere between none and extremely little, but probably closer to none, which is a credit to their acting skills, that people thought they were just sort of like, let's just turn the camera on and watch Groucho and Chico talk funny back and forth. It was the case that during rehearsals, if someone came up with something to add, they might do that, but it wasn't done on the spot while the cameras were running. And of course, the Marx Brothers' first two films, Coconuts and Animal Crackers, were based on their Broadway plays, which after Broadway they took on the road. So those were well-tested lines. But Groucho would change lines in the evolution of a play. He might come up with different lines. But the movies are a testament to how good they were at delivering material, because people thought, oh, they must just be making that up. But no, you're right. They had George Kaufman and S.J. Perelman and Maury Riskind and Irv Brecker and Nat Perrin and people like that. And even on You Bet Your Life, Groucho's quiz show, he had a staff of writers to prepare material. Not that he would have been lost without it, but there was an overhead projector that had suggested lines for him based on the interviews that the staff had done with the contestants ahead of time. And people will hear, oh, I didn't know he had writers, and their opinion of him will lessen somewhat. And it's like, no, it's because he was so good that you thought he was just sitting in a chair coming up with all that. And in fact, because they filmed a lot longer than the half-hour final edit, what ended up on the screen was very often what Groucho thought up at the time talking to the contestants, because you can't really guarantee that average non-acting people are going to remember to phrase it this way when Groucho asks you what your profession is or something like that. So a lot of it was off the top of his head. And then Bernie Smith was the head writer, and he told me that after the show was canceled, the writers had trouble getting work because their resume would say they were writers on You Bet Your Life for 12 years. And prospective employers would say, what are you talking about, writers on You Bet Your Life? He just sat there and was funny. They didn't have writers on that show.
Yeah, I don't think people really realize that. I mean, yes, the actors are good. They're funny at times, but they are only going to, like I said, be as good as the writing they have in front of them. And they make it work, don't get me wrong, because they get the material and they bring out the best in it. But people don't understand. That's why I understand, like, I don't want to get into it. I'll just leave this comment and leave it at that. That's why I understand why there is a writer's strike right now, because they do deserve to get what they're asking, because they do a lot of work.
Everything that unions, that the current members of unions take for granted, was probably the result of that union having had to get tough and go on strike at some point. Because unfortunately, management isn't given to being generous, because they feel like they'll be taken advantage of. If they let you have this, who knows where that'll end. So with the writers, everything like residuals and health insurance and reasonable working hours for the crew, and all the things that you think, well, sure, you get X amount extra if it goes over this many hours, and all those things had to be fought for. And when cable started, and the writers said we need to get a share of that, they said, well, we don't know what's going to happen with cable. It could just be a fluke. Let's just focus on the major network. And when they came out with VHS and then DVD, it's like, well, the home market is that's just going to be a fraction of what. Let's just stay focused on what people pay at the box office at theaters, or what sponsors pay to put a show on their network. But we can't start doling out money for home video things, or we'll go broke. That's their bottom line. Is always, we could never begin to afford that. And magically somehow they're able to find it, but only after a long and arduous and bitter strike, where people blame whichever union is on strike, saying you're keeping me from working. But then their turn comes up, and all of a sudden the International Alliance of Theatrical and Stage Employees, IATSE, feel like they have to go on strike because they're being worked to death and not being compensated, and there's not enough safety precautions on the set and things like that. So, yeah, but writers, people make the mistake of thinking, oh, well, if that person had writers, then I guess anyone could do it. But as you said, that performer brings out the best in the material. And it's a mistake to think that, for instance, Bob Hope would have been lost without all of his writers. And those of us in the baby boomer generation who only knew Hope from watching him read off cue cards on his TV specials didn't have a great impression of why Bob Hope was ever any kind of comedy icon. But if you listen to his radio shows from the 30s and 40s and look at his Paramount films and the road pictures he made with Bing Crosby, he really was a very skilled comic actor with great timing. And he did have a quick wit that others witnessed. Let me see. Dick Cavett, to drop a name, is a friend of mine. And at one time he worked on the staff of the Merv Griffin show before Dick had his own show.
Right.
And one night the guests were Maurice Chevalier and Bob Hope. So Dick Cavett hung out in the green room to eavesdrop, because he never stopped being that kid from Nebraska thinking, I can't believe they're paying me to hang out with these people. So he was listening to Bob Hope and Maurice Chevalier talking, and Hope said, hey, Maurice, you look terrific. What's your secret, man? And Chevalier said, well, I tell you, Bob, I don't drink and I don't fook. And Hope said, really? Do you sook? Which I thought is a fairly on-the-spot, clever comment on Mr. Hope's part. Not meant for any audience other than Chevalier, but Cavett was there to note the play on words, the French play on words that Hope pulled off. So anyway, but I digress, and quite well.
Right. So being at UCLA and then getting this unbelievable job as a student, working for what I would say probably was the most famous person in TV at the time, in Groucho Marx. I mean, maybe you didn't appreciate it then, but I mean, you have to look back and be like, wow, I can't believe that happened to me.
No,
So
I appreciated it at the time and never took any of it for granted. I mean, it turned into a 3-year job, the last 3 years of his life. And there was never a time when I drove over to his house thinking, I guess I'll sit around and deal with the fan mail and have lunch with Groucho and whoever comes over. And there was always something significant. And I never stopped being appreciative of the fact that I had that job. When I would see tour buses coming by and idling in front of the house, I would wave through the kitchen window had a sort of lattice work plants in front of it, and I would wave, figuring someone in the van is going to say, "I think Groucho Marx might have waved to me." I don't know. Someone waved to me from his house because I always sort of had one foot in that tour bus as a fan, and unlike a lot of occasions where it's only in retrospect that you really appreciate who someone was, I was really an obsessive fan at the time. All I wanted to do in life was shake Groucho's hand and thank him for the laughs, and then I could die. But I didn't think there was any chance our paths would ever cross. So when I did meet him and then got the job, the people that I was meeting in his house, I was very familiar with them because I was such an obsessive fan. I'd read the Groucho letters. I knew who his old writers were, his old directors, his circle of writer friends, both from the Groucho letters and from watching the names roll by at the end of the movies. So even though I was just this 19 or 20-year-old kid, Groucho would introduce me to Nat Perrin, and he would be thinking, you have no idea who any of us alta cockers are, do you? And I'd say, you're Nat Perrin. You worked on Monkey Business and Horse Feathers and Duck Soup, and you created the Addams Family, and you're Irv Brecker. You wrote at the... And it's like, wow, this kid really knows who we are. So I didn't have to kick myself later thinking if only I'd been older, I would have been able to appreciate it, because I met him at the absolute zenith of I almost became a stalker, really. My roommate and I at the time went to a restaurant we heard that he would go to called Jacopo's Pizzeria in Beverly Hills. And they had a Groucho special on the menu. But I remember I said to my friend, well, they have like the Eddie Cantor at a delicatessen, but he's been dead for years, and it doesn't. So I said to the waitress, does Groucho Marx really come in here? And she said, oh, yes, he was in here. Let me see. Yesterday, as a matter of fact. And he always comes in right after we open, and he always tries to pay with a $100 bill because he knows we can't make change. He's so funny. And I thought, why is Groucho being wasted on this waitress? Why wasn't it me? Should I get a sleeping bag and stake out Jacopo's Pizzeria? It really was so frustrating because I figured, his hourglass is running out. He was in his mid-80s and not in great health. And I just thought there's just no chance our paths will cross, but happy to have been wrong about that. And it was because at UCLA, I started a committee and a petition drive to try to get Animal Crackers re-released. It had been made at Paramount in 1930, and then over the years, the rights had expired and reverted back to the writers of the play. And then when Paramount sold its old films to Universal in the late 50s, Animal Crackers was among them, but they didn't have the right to syndicate it as part of their MCA TV old movie packages on television. And they didn't think there was any reason to spend good money trying to untangle an old Marx Brothers movie. So it just was in mothballs. But all my friends were Marx Brothers fans, and we all knew this was like the holy grail missing link of Marx Brothers movies. So we started a petition drive to basically shame Universal and show them that there was this crowd of people that can't wait to see this old movie. And I got in touch with a woman named Erin Fleming, who was in charge of Groucho's life at that time. She had started as just his secretary, but had become his manager, and really, as he got older and weaker, he got more dependent on her to make decisions, business decisions and household and that sort of thing. And she brought him to UCLA, and there were all sorts of news people there and cameras and a crowd of kids. And I said, Groucho, I am very happy to be meeting you after all this time. And he said, well, you should be. And Aaron said, this is Steve Stoliar. He's the one who's trying to get Animal Crackers re-released. And Groucho said, well, so did you get it? And I said, not yet, but we're working on it. And he said, well, you better or I'll fire you. And I said, I didn't even realize I was working for you. How much are you paying me? And he said, a little less than nothing. and it's like I'm sitting there thinking, I can't believe I'm conversing with this mythic creature. I don't believe this. And sure enough, Universal relented, and they untangled the legal mess and brought the film out. They were going to bring it out in Westwood near UCLA and in New York, where they figured the old movie buffs are. And that was going to be it. And it ended up breaking the house record at the UA Westwood that had been set by the French Connection several years earlier. And there were lines around the block of kids in tennis shoes and T-shirts and blue jeans. And in New York, at the re-premiere there, Groucho was almost trampled by the crowd. They had policemen on horseback trying to keep people back. And it did really well, which was personally very gratifying for me because I knew it wasn't just my obsessive compulsive Marx friends that cared about seeing this movie. And then because a couple of summer jobs fell through that year, 1974, I felt I had nothing to lose by calling this Erin Fleming woman and asking if there was anything at all I could do. Because my dad was saying, I don't want you sitting around on your fanny all summer. Go get a job. Go to Taco Bell and see if they need someone, or wash dishes. And I thought, I don't want to do that. Well, sure enough, Aaron said, well, I used to be Groucho's secretary, but I've become his manager, and there's so much fan mail now because of all the interest by young people in Groucho and the Marx Brothers. And we need someone to handle the fan mail, and also someone who really knows their Marx Brothers to organize all of Groucho's memorabilia for eventual donation to the Smithsonian. And I'm thinking, oh, I don't want to wake up from this, please. And sure enough, she hired me, and I could make my own hours. I thought it would be in an office building, and Groucho would come in, once or twice a month to sign checks or something. And she said, oh, no, dear, there's a room at the house you can use for your office. And they were paying me money to immerse myself in all of Groucho's scripts and letters and posters and clippings and photos of the brothers out of makeup and vaudeville and letters from presidents, and then the parade of people that came in addition to his extant brothers Zeppo and Gummo, to be able to spend time with Jack Lemmon and Bob Hope and Mae West and George Burns and Groucho's writers, Nat Perrin, S.J. Perelman, Maury Riskind, people who went back to the 20s. And then just to be able to comfortably converse with this man whose hand I only wanted to briefly shake before he shuffled off, and instead got this, remarkable 3-year gig. And, in addition to the fact that he was Groucho Marx, the same guy I saw with the grease paint mustache and duck soup and sitting at the desk on You Bet Your Life, he was someone that personally knew mythic figures like George Gershwin and Irving Berlin and W.C. Fields. These people were friends of his. And I think of them in black and white, and he knew them as pals. Plus, since he was born in 1890, he had firsthand memories that went from before the Wright brothers to after Armstrong's landing on the moon, which really appealed to my art historical sense, because I've always been a big fan of history. And this man was like a living time capsule with firsthand memories going back to the turn of the century. So it was just an amazing, the downside of it was watching my hero fade out and having a front row center seat to, the last act of his life, and also putting up with Aaron Fleming, who was a very mercurial and mentally unbalanced woman. So it was a very volatile atmosphere, and I wasn't used to that because I grew up in a very middle of the road house where people didn't scream and throw things, and she was given to fits of rage and paranoia, perceiving enemies everywhere, hiring and firing people. I really don't know how I managed to last as long as I did, but it was an amazing growing experience for me. As I say, I was just 19 when I got the job, but it was, it changed my life. I switched from being a history major to motion picture television and was interested in being a writer. And just a mind-blowing thing that I never took for granted. And then I put it into book form called Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House.
Right.
And that's being made into a movie, which blows what's left of my mind. Currently on hold, but everybody who was attached to it is still attached to it. Jeffrey Rush is going to play the old Groucho, and he's champing at the bit to get going on this because he thinks it's just a perfect role for him, and I'm delighted that he wants to do it. So it's been quite a ride since I crossed paths with him in '74.
It really has. And think about this, Steve. Some of the shows that you've been able to write for, Simon and Simon, which was very popular. And then, of course, Murder, She Wrote, which lasted 12 seasons, I believe. And, I mean, just the list of things you've been able to do. You've wrote stuff for the Charlie Brown cartoons and stuff.
I did
just,
voices, too.
Yeah, and did voiceovers as well. So, I mean, let me ask you, tell me the difference between writing for a film and writing for a TV sitcom. Because the TV sitcom, you got to kind of have it, you may be asked to do it several times throughout the season. A film, you got to write the script, you got to keep going back and forth, and there's similarities, but there's a lot of differences as well.
Film is obviously much more of a long-term project, and hopefully they're carefully handcrafted. There's all of the crew and producers and director and stars, and you're making something that's 90 minutes or 2 hours long. With a TV show, as a freelancer, the thing already exists, the framework of it. If you go pitch stories to one show, you have hopefully already seen episodes of it, so you know how the characters behave, what kind of, whether it's if it's a comedy, what kind of humor they have, and who would have that line, and what the other person would say. And you have to allow for nuts and bolts things like commercial breaks, that you're really restricted on length, page length, and running time length. Unlike a film, you're fitting into the structure. Also with TV, it's very much the producer's medium, while film tends to be the director's, which is why when I met S.J. Perelman at Groucho's house, he advised me to be a playwright, because he said they have more control over their words than screenwriters or television writers. But I'm not sure you can make a living writing plays, but just in terms of pure art, he was right. But it's, for instance, I wrote a few episodes of a show called Sliders, which was a science fiction.
Great show. Yep.
And the executives the network executives and the executives on the show kept changing their minds about what the tone of the show would be and what the sort of average episode would be like. It's like, should this be more serious? Should this be more fanciful? Should it be a conscious emulation of some of the blockbuster science fiction films? Can we adapt them for an hour-long show? And you know, your job is to give them as close to what they're looking for as you can, and then the regular writers on the show will take it and knock it into shape before they film it. But you know, you don't really have the freedom to write whatever you want because you're writing within the parameters. Here's a good example of that. There was a show called Lime Street with Robert Wagner, where he played an insurance company sort of detective, checking out claims that lead to crimes. And the producer was Mark Crowley, who had written a very famous play made into a film called The Boys in the Band, which was one of the first serious looks at a group of gay men. I watched it last couple weeks ago, and it seems very dated now, but at the time it was very daring. Anyway, he was a bright, well-read, sensitive guy, and he was the one who was listening to story pitches. So I went in and to pitch him some stories for the show. And there was one in particular that I thought had the best chance. So after I told him the premise, he said, what you're basically proposing is a combination of My Man Godfrey, Preston Sturgis, and Melvin and Howard. Now, under any other circumstances, I would consider that among the highest praise imaginable. But what he was saying was, this doesn't belong in our TV series. This is like these people. And so it remains sort of the most flattering rejection I've ever gotten, because he was saying, you didn't plug into what we're looking for. You went a little too far in this direction. So you don't have that kind of face the blank page and write whatever you want that you might with a film. In my case, I'm one of two writers on the adaptation of my book, and so I already know the characters, and then it becomes a matter of budget and narrative and what deserves to be in the film, because you can't just change the margins and retype the book manuscript and call that a film script. You have to sort of climb up the tree and saw off the branches that aren't really part of a movie version. So even within that, even having lived the story and young Steve being one of the main characters, even then, I don't have complete freedom to just go off on a tangent or insist that this sequence stay in, because there's too many other factors. But it is a different feeling than writing for a TV show that's all set up with people you're familiar with.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Definitely does, and thank you for breaking it down. So let me ask you this. Angela Lansbury, I mean, she was phenomenal, and let's be honest, she was the star of Monday Nights. That show was very popular. Just talk about working with her and what that was like.
Well, actually, I didn't work with her because as a freelance writer, I met with the other producers. Peter Fisher created the series, and Levinson and Link, Richard Levinson and William Link, who also did Columbo. So I wasn't down on the set. However, I did get it appreciated. I appreciated the fact that my episode turned out to be the last time that Robert Sterling and Ann Jeffries acted together, because when I was a kid in St. Louis watching Topper, with Leo G. Carroll, Robert Sterling and Ann Jeffries played the two ghosts that haunted Topper. And they were a real life married couple that were together for decades. And my episode ended up being the last thing they did together.
Wow.
I did, Universal was a like a second home for me, because after Groucho died, I got a job in the steno pool, sitting at a Selectric 2, typing scripts every day from 11 to 8 for Rockford Files and Columbo and Kojak and Meta. And so it was strange to go back as a writer and not as a secretary. And I remember one time about to go into the producer's building, and the double glass doors opened, and this late middle-aged woman came out. And for some reason in my mind, I recognized her probably as one of the older secretaries that I knew. And I said, "Hi." And Angela Lansbury said, "Hello." Oh, Jesus. It's that thing where you see someone out of context, like you see a teacher at the grocery store, or someone you went to camp with at a gas station or something, and it's like, I know, are you a waitress from a place I go to, or did I go to school with you? And you only have an instant to try to place the face. So she was just a familiar face, one of hundreds that I knew on the lot, but it wasn't because she was a secretary, it's because it was Angela Lansbury.
Wow, that's a pretty cool story.
But I mean, because I was such an old movie buff, I didn't really care much about, when I was in the steno pool, I didn't care that much about the current shows. I didn't care about seeing Lindsay Wagner and Robert Blake. But when they would have guest stars, I would try to find out who was going to be a guest star, and so I got to meet, for instance, Lauren Bacall on the set of Rockford Files. And I got to meet Fred Astaire at, of all places, the Galactica soundstage. This was the initial series with Richard Hatch from the late 70s. And Fred Astaire's grandson or granddaughter said, "Grandpa, I think grandson, that's my favorite show. Will you be on it?" So Astaire contacted and of course they were thrilled and wrote a whole episode around him. And I got to meet him on the set and have him sign a picture. I mean, of all the un-Fred Astaire-like places, he's, in a space suit, the set of a spaceship. But I got to meet Cab Calloway on the set of the Blues Brothers. It didn't mean much to me that it was the Blues Brothers, even though I love Belushi and Aykroyd. But oh my God, it's really Cab Calloway talking to me. So, that was another sort of wonderland for me to wander around. And I never understood, there were so many other people that worked there, and to them it was just you clock in and you do your job and you clock out. And they had no curiosity. I mean, I used to go over to stage 12, which was where Chaney Sr. filmed The Phantom of the Opera. And the removable balcony seats were still there. They still used it when Universal would make a movie or TV show and there'd be a scene in a theater. They would shoot it there. So you see the same set pop up in a lot, including the remake with Claude Rains in Technicolor from '43. I loved the old horror films at Universal. So it was just so cool to wander around there. And, security people didn't give me any kind of hassle. I used to see Hitchcock being driven in the back of a very dark green Lincoln Continental. Shortly after he was knighted, Lou Wasserman, who was the CEO of MCA Universal, had a luncheon in Hitchcock's honor in the commissary. And I happened to walk past the side door, which was where the executive dining room was. And the door flew open, and this tall, tan, white-haired man with black rimmed glasses came out and Cary Grant flashed me 1,000-watt smile.
Wow.
And I felt like a middle-aged housewife with her hair in curlers. It's, oh, Cary Grant smiled at me. Oh my God. So it was just I mean, because I had an imagination and a love and knowledge of classic Hollywood, it was never, I mean, it was drudgery just sitting at the Selectric 2 hammering out scripts. But I loved to go a-wandering around that place and some of my adventures there.
Right. So let me ask you, Steve, when you're writing for a TV series, I'll example the new WKRP in Cincinnati, do they give you what they kind of want for that episode, and you really have to kind of write how you want it to start, the middle, the end?
Well,
I mean, how does it work? I mean, do you come up with the episode yourself?
Ideally, as I said before, you're familiar with the show. You've seen some episodes of it, so you don't go in there saying, you know, this person flies to Mars and then goes back in time. And you say, no, it's a radio station in Cincinnati. They wouldn't do that. You know, I would sit with a legal pad and a pen and think of ideas that seem like they might work for episodes of a particular show. And I would kind of sketch out a rough beginning, middle, and end, but not spend too much time on it because it was too easy for them to go, no, we did one like that. Next. And you'd spend all this time. And then if one or more of those ideas grabs them, they may ask you to go home and flesh it out a little more. This is another thing that writer strikes, you know, previous writer strikes fought and won. It used to be in the olden days that they could call you back in however many times they want and say, no, I think this part should be shorter. Go home and put, you know, no, I think now it needs this. Go home and put that. You know, as a matter of fact, I don't think this episode's going to work. Never mind. And take advantage of writers by, you know, sort of siphoning off their brain juice and then changing their mind after all that work was put in it. So now they're obligated to purchase the story after a certain number of meetings. And then after you do an initial draft of the script, they owe you for the first draft of the script. They can't, you know, string you along. And then when you do a second draft, you get the final payment, and then there's residuals. But hopefully one of your ideas intrigues them, and then they'll say, you know, or it could take place at a summer camp. Give me like a one-page outline of how that might shake down. And then if it still seemed like a feasible thing for their show, then they would eventually send me home to do the script.
Right.
And then you turn that in, and either they give you notes on it or they take it from there. But at least you're compensated for it. And, you know, sometimes it just doesn't bear it. By the time it winds up on TV, it doesn't bear any resemblance to what you've turned in. It's like taking the dust jacket of one book and wrapping it around another. So people would see an episode of the show I wrote and they'd say, why did you have that thing with the bucket of water? And I'd say, the bucket of water was nowhere near the script I turned in, but they decided they wanted to redo this part. So it's their show and they know best what they want. So it's a collaboration where you come up with some feasible ideas, and if they think it's worthy, then they ask one step at a time, outline and story, first draft, second draft.
Right. One thing too, Steve, that's very important about being a writer, especially in your case when you're writing documentaries and things like that, is not only do you have to write, but you have to read as well, because example, you did some documentaries on the Beatles, Elvis Presley. you really have to research that. You have to be willing to spend time to read, and you may have to read for a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever it may be, just to, have the proper research. So while the writing is one thing you have to do, you also, like I said, you have to do a lot of reading as well. And I think people sometimes underestimate just what goes into being a writer.
Well, also with documentaries, you're often dealing with a lot of footage and then either new or vintage interviews. Either you're conducting interviews with people and you know what you want them to talk about, or you do an interview and then you see what you have and think, okay, that would work for talking about the boyhood or before the music or whatever the thing is. And so you end up sort of becoming an editor, thinking, oh, this will dovetail nicely into that film clip. This goes good with what that guy said about what he was like on the set when the cameras weren't running. And so you're assembling this puzzle to tell a story between writing, as you point out, the narration, which has all sorts of information about it. I think ideally the best documentaries don't have narration. If you can get the people and the footage to tell the story, it's better. Or if you really have the luxury of time and access to the interview subject, you can see if there's a hole in the storyline. Rather than covering it with narration, go to one of the people you interviewed and say, can you talk about when he married his first wife and the impact that had? And then it's like you can take a chunk of that and put it in and then go, now we've got a beginning, middle, and end that seems to make sense. So yeah, doing a documentary was a different creature because you're dealing with a lot of elements besides just words.
Yeah. So tell us, I know like things are a little up in the air, and hopefully that strike gets settled soon, because that movie about Groucho just looks so fascinating. I really can't wait to see it. But what else could we look forward to for you, and as 23 comes to a close, and what 24 might bring?
You're asking me to predict the future. My goodness. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I've done a couple of other books. I put together a book of my father's wartime letters to my mother from when he was fighting the Nazis in Europe. And that came out last year. That was called Salamis and Swastikas, Letters Home from a GI Jew. Because he was basically this secular Jew who had really never been outside of St. Louis, and all of a sudden he's thrown into North Africa and Italy and Germany, and part of him is appreciating it from the historical and political point of view, and the other part is trying to stay alive and missing the hell out of his wife and baby daughter, my oldest sister, who's now 81, and plus a lot of photos. And it was a hell of that was a massive editing job, because there were hundreds and hundreds of letters totaling thousands of pages. And I couldn't just feed them into my computer, because many were handwritten, and even the ones that were typed, it wouldn't allow me to take out a paragraph and put this up here, and so I had to just sit and pound the keyboard. It's like, all right, so now he's in France, and and now we're in August of 44, and he's about to get to Italy, But it was very gratifying, and people seem to enjoy. There's a lot of humor in there, and just the stories about like the movies they're seeing, and I get his little thumbnail reviews, saw to have and have not. I don't think this Lauren Bacall has any kind of future. Her voice is too deep. And discussing what the top songs of the day were and comparing them with the ones my mom liked, and just this overwhelming yearning, missing his wife and child. I mean, Woody Allen said he doesn't think he could have survived what my dad survived, being separated from his family like that, when he read the pain that my dad put in the letter. Plus just fun stuff like going to see a Bob Hope show and Dad's dog jumping out of his arms and running across the stage, and Hope saying, "Hey, you better hold on to that dog. If Crosby sees it, he'll throw a saddle over it." And just, I don't know. It was a lot more interesting stuff than my sisters and I thought there'd be. But I don't know. I'm a versatile fellow, and still interested in doing voice work. Still auditioning for different voice jobs, and still have high hopes for the Groucho movie, which I think will. I mean, all of a sudden, people will know who I am because that kid in the. I mean, we have Charlie Plummer right now playing the part of young Steve, and that's going to be positively surreal to walk onto the set of a movie based on a chunk of my life from 45 years ago, seeing people reenacting things I lived through, seeing people play people I knew, including Steve at one with mutton chops and a mustache and my Snoopy Joe Cool shirt, because it was the 70s, man.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's really the focus. And, you know, it's been a very long and winding road trying to get an independent film finance is not for the squeamish, and it's been a real roller coaster, but gratifying and frustrating in alternating amounts. But we'll see how it works out.
Well, Steve, I really hope it does. Like I said, I would love to watch that. I think that would be just phenomenal. I think it'd be phenomenal to see. But I want to thank you for giving me a few minutes today. It was a real honor for me. You're a credit to the business, but I mean, just like the life you've lived, I mean, that is just a tremendous career that you've had. And I mean, I congratulate you because you've really been a major part of Hollywood, which started when you were 19 years old in my book. So congratulations for that.
Well, I think you're going a little too far, but I'm not going to wrestle you to the ground and correct you. So thank you for the effusive praise. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you again for coming on.
Mike?
Yeah,
Kenichi. So you're Japanese? I thought you were Italian, but...
No, Kenichi.
Kenichi was good day in Japanese,
Yeah.
But I can see, you know, don't be ashamed of your Asian heritage. Be proud of it. You know? I've never understood why tiramisu is an Italian dessert and not a Japanese soup. So if you want to say Kenichi is Italian, I'll let you. It's your name. Fine.
Well, I can promise you this. My father will tell you it's Italian for sure. So
okay. I don't want to get in trouble with him.
Yeah. But thank you again. I appreciate it. And let's do it again sometime when that movie comes out. Let's have you back on because I think that'd be great.
It's a date. Thanks a lot,
again.
It was fun.
Yep. Well, folks, that was the one and only Steve Stoliar, and it was a pleasure to have him on for In the Spotlight. I'm Mike Kenichi saying good night, everyone.